Okay, folks, last session. Brief, short. I'd like to bring you together for a conversation with two friends. Lydia Harvey, who's the Executive Director, ESG Specialist at JP Morgan Global Index Research. But most importantly, she's an Australian, as far as I'm concerned. We have that in our background. So this is about the Australian mafia taking over next. Nicholas, who unfortunately is a mixed heritage, he's French, American, very complicated.
And my mother's Australian.
And Australian. Oh, well, that's a good side, yeah. Good to know.
There's
Nicholas
a pattern here.
Pfaff, my old friend, is Deputy CEO now of the International Capital Markets Association and Head of Sustainable Finance. He's been the guy steering, helping, supporting the green bond principles for a lot of years now.
A decade.
Is it a decade? I'm sorry.
We're not getting young, sure.
Now, we're going to have a short conversation to wrap up today's session about the path forward, what it looks for. You've heard about the year, but we're taking a slightly longer horizon today. And pleased to have these two. By the way, I also have to thank JP Morgan as a sponsor. Not that it's Lydia's decision, she's here as a speaker, but for supporting us, and International Capital Markets Association as part of the partnership we're having with ICMA. They've joined as a sponsor of this particular event. So thank you. But let's get on to the question. The question is, where are we going? And of course, as I said at the beginning of the day, how are we going to get there? Speed, scale. I'd like to start with you, Lydia, because you've been talking to clients, talking to customers, and you've got a sense of the nature of appetite. I mean, you've grown the thematic index business, for example, hugely just in the last year. What's your view about the longer term, how it's shaping up at the moment, and how we're going to get to the requisite scale?
Great question. Thanks for having me. So as you mentioned, we do have a suite of ESG indices that have been around since 2018, and they're doing very well. We have 40 billion tracking those indices, predominantly fixed income emerging markets. But our investors are increasingly interested in thematics, and so they want low carbon indices in both sovereign and corporate fixed income. They also want labeled bond indices as well. So in 2020, with CBI data, we launched a green bond index, which tracks all the labeled bond issuance globally in green bonds. And excitingly, last month, we actually improved and we launched a green social and sustainability index, which kind of sits above that as a parent index, tracking all the GSS labeled bond issuance globally. So this is really exciting, and that's actually just off the back of pure client demand, which started off, with enthusiasm. Can you please make this? And then started becoming a little bit more aggressive. Guys, where is this benchmark? We need it now. So that's great, but I think by and large, it's not a demand problem, right? It's a supply problem, and I'm probably not saying anything that wasn't already said today. We know the demand is there, and most of our investors are focused on emerging markets, and they have told us time and time again, we really want to invest in climate allocations in EM. There's just simply not enough supply. So we did a survey of our EM clients with sovereign strategies, and they said that they're focusing on issuer-level ESG still, rather than instrument-level ESG, because the bond market in EM is still too nascent. So it's a supply problem. They're desperate to allocate to that market across corporates, sovereigns, quasis, etc. But the supply just isn't there. If you look at the split of our green bond and GSS indices, it's 85 DM, 15 EM. So they want to do it. They're desperately trying to consider positive climate impact, but they're just citing the lack of label bond issuance as a major constraint. I'll stop there, and maybe I can share some further insights later on.
So you said two incredibly important things there, just to reverberate in the room. No problem with demand. It's all a supply issue. So if you know anyone who could do a green bond, come on. And you said emerging markets, and you don't mean West Virginia, which I suppose would qualify as an emerging market, but you're talking about the basket of emerging markets and JP Morgan emerging market is. So I've got two questions around that. How deep is that demand, and is it all high grade? Is it like sovereign level issuance, Indian green sovereign that's coming through? Does it go down the rating level one hand? And also, do we see the prospect of an increase of companies? Because there's a limited number of emerging markets in that index. Is that what's going on with that question?
Okay, good question. So to take it kind of the second one first, I suppose there's still the classic index eligibility criteria,
Yep.
right? So it needs to be, we've got different sleeves. There's hard currency sleeves. We have an EM version, which is hard currency only, but the regular version will allow local and hard currency issuance. But there are various hurdles. So if it's hard currency, it needs to be 300 million US dollars, 300 million euros, 150 million GBP. And if it's a local issuance, it's only sovereigns. It has to be over $1 billion to get into the index. So sometimes the problem, it's two things. One, there's just not enough issuance globally, full stop.
Yep.
And then secondly, they still need to meet the index, eligibility criteria to get in. So there's that additional hurdle as well, unfortunately. But the reason why we have made so many versions of these new indices is because the demand is multifaceted. So we have the parent GSS index, we have the EM hard currency sleeve breakout of that, which has a diversification methodology put on top. And then importantly and critically, we have ESG versions of these funds, of these benchmarks as well. So some investors only care about the use of proceeds and whether or not they're labelled. It doesn't matter who you are as an issuer, as long as it's in the CBI database, it's green, social sustainability, it's all good. But increasingly, as some of my other panelists were speaking about, with the pressure to label your fund and evidence that, there's an increasing focus on issuer level ESG. I know that came through both of the panels before, actually. So we have ESG versions of these benchmarks as well, where we apply issuer level ESG criteria, we screen out the worst performers, we exclude controversial weapons, tobacco, UNGC failing issuers, etc. So we need to have all these different versions of these labelled bond indices to meet the many different types of demands. And then there's also custom requests. There's clients who just want corporate. There's clients that don't want to have supranational issuers in their portfolio. So we have to sometimes meet that demand as well and kind of create customs. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that's useful. But you see another interesting point, which Nicholas might want to pick on, which is this fusion of the use of proceeds idea with also an ESG screening of the entity, which is a bit of a development of the market, right? It's reflected actually, Nicholas, in the putative green bond standard. In Europe, I've argued publicly that the entity requirement is way too tough because which is where under the voluntary green bond standard that the European Commission is bringing in, companies to issue green bonds have to have an auditable transition plan. And I'm sort of saying, my view is actually green bonds are an icebreaker. You get people doing green bonds or other thematic bonds, and then they move up the supply chain to a proper transition plan. So we've got to be careful not to make it too hard to get in. But you're part of this green bond standard working group, crucially. Tell us your perspective on how this is all going, and I'm interested in your reflections. What Lydia said about this merging of ideas.
We shouldn't get too bogged down in the UGBS discussion because you and I can just go on and on about it. But on the specific point, that there's a misunderstanding in the policy debate that's evolved in the UGBS, particularly with the involvement of the EU Parliament, and that is that entity level is very important, but it's covered by other regulations which already exist, particularly CSRD, which is coming out, and so there's actually no point whatsoever in duplicating this at the issuer level. It's just it's duplicative, it adds extra costs, and it serves no real purpose. And for us, it's obvious. We're having trouble making this point, but I think we're slowly winning the argument. But I think on this broader point of how do you bring together the issuer level and the labeled bond level? One, it's happened through the evolution of the principles where over time we've more and more required for green bonds to have visibility on the trajectory, more disclosure. It's happened with a specific product, sustainability linked bonds, which are designed to track at the issue level. But I think, and making the link also with scale, we're not going to do everything we need to do with the labeled bond market. I mean, I'd love to say the opposite. It'd be great if we could do it all with GSS bonds, but I don't think that's correct. And so, indeed, we need to find a way of bringing the broader fixed income market into the conversation. And that's where issuer level disclosures are important from a regulatory point of view, but it's also where we need to get this debate on ESG ratings right. And this is what we've been hearing earlier. And I think that's going to be a key conversation. And I've got a piece of news which you may not know, but this morning with the FCA, the UK regulator, we've launched a working group out of London, which is going to work on a code of conduct for ESG rating providers and database providers. And this is, in a transition towards regulation. And the FCA has been very clear they probably want to regulate this, but they want the market to come up with something that works. And then when we've got that framework, they'll then decide how they regulate. And we're hoping that this will be a blueprint not only for the UK markets, but also will set a sort of global reference point for other jurisdictions to look at this.
That's amazing news. That's really good news. Of course, all of this is important for the SEC because as they're starting to struggle with these rules, we want them to see what's working in Europe and what isn't working in Europe and apply accordingly and pick up on it. And so that question about the extent of regulation around ESG, green bond, the nature of disclosures, I guess is a live issue. Is the whole shift, the SEC draft regulation, which is very exciting, by the way, it's been a fantastic movement, although you've heard the previous speakers talk about we need a bit more in different areas. Is this impacting you in any practical fashion yet in the clients for the business and how you tackle this issue? Or is this something for the way distant future? I'm just curious.
Oh, I mean, unfortunately, every conversation I have with clients is about regulation now. So even though it doesn't impact me as a benchmark administrator, it impacts the asset management. I mean, most of them are focused on investors, but the investors use benchmarks and they come to us for assistance in meeting their regulatory requirements. So we're constantly being asked to kind of classify our benchmarks, provide disclosure, transparency, report against PAIs, basically meet all the same hurdles as our investors, which makes it incredibly difficult. And I think investors have a lot of hope that the labeled bond market will help them to kind of justify and validate the labeling on their funds as well.
That's a beautiful point. and presumably you're optimistic about doing that. I mean, it makes sense because the nature of the disclosures involved, thanks to the green bond principles and like, are evident, clear, and more to the point standardized now, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's some that are more developed than others, which everybody here knows, right? So we have to take a slightly conservative approach with our benchmarks. So in our ESG, like standard ESG benchmarks, we give green bonds an overweight, like we give them preference. As yet, we're not giving that same treatment to social sustainability and SLB bonds because half the investors we speak to are really positive and love those instruments, and the other half are, a little bit worried about the credibility of them and the reporting, etc. So we sort of take the temperature of our clients every sort of quarter, and then I think when there's sufficient demand for it, we will give all those labeled bonds an overweight in our regular ESG indices. It's just going to take a little bit of time, and unfortunately, we also we rely on the CBI. Like we're an independent benchmark administrator. We don't make any kind of verification ourselves. We have to get it from a third party. So we need the same level of scrutiny that happens on green bonds to happen on social and sustainability bonds for us to give them the same level of treatment in a benchmark. And I think, for SLBs in particular, at the moment, they're not part of our green social sustainability benchmarks for that exact reason. Like there's a split level of comfort. All of our asset managers that have in-house expertise and teams of people, they love SLBs because they're minimizing the risk because they're looking at every single issuance with a fine-tooth comb. Whereas the passive guys, they don't have that and they would rather not be caught with their pants down. So SLBs are not included, but that will change in time.
Tell me about that, because, of course, passive is a very large slice of the whole sector.
Yeah.
How's it going to change? And again, I had a conversation with Vanguard's head of climate change. Did you know Vanguard had a climate change? Isn't that cool? But I still can't figure out how he's going to do it given the nature of the mandates he's got. Give us a bit of colour what's going on in the passive space and how this change is going to happen. I'm curious.
So my understanding at the moment of the AUM that uses our benchmarks is that it's about 50-50. So half of it is passive and half of it is active. And honestly, it's really tough when you're doing like governance around ESG to kind of keep everybody happy, because the active guys, it's not that they want you to not make the best benchmark possible, but they also don't mind if it's not perfect because it makes it easier for them to beat it. Whereas the passive guys really push hard to make sure that you're doing like the best you could possibly do in that situation. They just have completely different demand characteristics from my perspective. And I sort of have to play more towards the passive space and make sure that we're taking a conservative approach. And that's why we do things like not include SLBs. But it's coming back to the quality of the disclosures from the issuers, the comfort of the market, and the standardization around instruments. It's about the databases that we get that information from, the CBI, and the follow-up verification that you do. Once the passive guys feel comfortable that there's someone doing independent and external verification, then they'll be totally fine because they're totally fine with green bonds, right? So
Right.
it's kind of a data problem, I think.
So that's an interesting opportunity. I'm curious, Nicholas, we've heard about SLBs. We've heard about, Elenia's been talking about the comforts that are going to make this work or other instruments work. What are you seeing about other instruments? You've had an SLB working group, for example, of the Green Bond Principles, but you've also had you've done work on a variety of instruments.
Yeah.
What's next?
Do you want me to comment on SLBs? I want to tell you what's next.
I really want you to tell me how we're going to get $5 trillion a year, but I'll take what I can get.
Okay, let me start with SLBs. And it's really interesting to be in the US and talk about SLBs because there's a lot of resistance here. I'm very interested, generally, how conservative, in fact, what you're saying about green bonds. I keep on hearing it. I mean, we love green bonds, but everything else makes them nervous, which is great. I mean, we've had a decade of green bonds. It's wonderful to see them so accepted. But on SLBs, I'm convinced it's an amazing product, but it's not a mature product yet. We've had the conversation around materiality inhibition. We've tried to respond with the guidance on the KPIs. For those of you who don't know it, we've got a registry of 300 KPIs, which are categorized by sector. We've also made a distinction between primary and core and secondary KPIs. I think there's more work we can do in this space, and this whole issue of how do you benchmark gender ambition isn't closed. I mean, we've made a contribution towards that. The other really interesting question is, and this is a personal opinion, I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but there's a conversation on should we be differentiating SLBs, and is it do we need to qualify SLBs with respect to transition, for example? Do we need to have sub-labels of SLBs? I don't know what the answer is, but what I'm seeing in the market is there's some confusion which is arising from the inherent flexibility of the product. I mean, you could do an SLB which doesn't have any E in it. I mean, you can do it in gender, you can do it in healthcare, and there won't be an E aspect into it, and that's fine, and the product allows you to do that. But then you go out to the wider stakeholders and they say, well, why isn't there E in it? It's a bit like the ESG debate, where you can score well in S&G and you're not great on the E, but you're still in the index, right? And that we know that's been a major problem. And so you're seeing a variation of that arising around SLBs. And then, even though I think the great majority of the market has integrity, we've seen some examples of gaming around SLBs. And the sort of more innocent SLB gaming is, well, let's set a target which is really easy. right? We've seen a bit of that.
Yeah.
Let's make a sort of really kind of sure bet here. And you can see how in a corporate context that's going to be a great temptation. But what you've also seen at the other extreme is situations where you're not meeting your target and you're sort of sitting there and saying, "Is there a way we can fix this?" And that is not in the spirit, obviously, of SLBs. Now, what else is on the horizon? I've mentioned ESG ratings. I won't repeat it. I think that is a very important development. We are aiming to give guidance specifically for high yield, but that in the use of proceed and also in the SLB space, and I think that's going to be interesting. The other thing is the recurring question, which came up earlier today, on what about transition bonds? And it's important to understand that one, we didn't create a label for transition bonds because you can do transition with SLBs or use of proceeds. It was difficult to do a label. That's the simple answer, and I keep on saying it. And it's still, particularly in the wider market, there's a lack of comprehension. But nonetheless, coming back to SLBs, 70 to 80% of SLBs have a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target. So if you're looking for a nascent transition market, see SLBs. Now, the other frontier, which CBI has done some great work on, is, well, what about transition projects? Now, we don't have guidance on transition projects at ICMA, but it's clearly an important topic. And why is it challenging? Because you'd like to be able to do green transition bonds, right? And so you call it a green bond. And there's some bonds out there which are green transition bonds. The problem is all transition bonds aren't green, right? So you need to create a category where it's use of proceeds for transition bonds. It's not green. And then what's the parameters? Again, CBI has been working on it, others are working on it. And why is it important? Because the government of Japan is going to come out next year, and their plan is to throw $100 billion a year in the market for transition bonds, which won't necessarily be green. So more work for you, Sean, and for me.
And me.
Yeah, and you. Yes, absolutely.
With respect to the Japanese government, I think they're now calling them green transformation bonds, and we are hopeful that they will do them in line of international laws rather than putting stuff there that doesn't fit international perspectives on a transition. But the idea that a whole government is trying to drive a transition is a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
And the principle behind MITI, Ministry of Economic Trade and Industry's work around transition is really good. We have some arguments with some of the criteria in their work, but you will see a lot of corporates coming to market next year with instruments that link back to the National Transition Plan. And they have made an aggressive 2030 commitment, still figuring out how to do it. But interesting times. It goes back to my earlier thing about next year really is a year of figuring out how to do it. But in the longer run, is the whole market going to become green, or is this going to become a bit like Swami said in the earlier thing, where credit rating agencies start just integrating that in all models? Because actually, Jorg Kell's right in saying we should be looking about all of these issues just as risk issues, and this is just the stage we go through to draw attention to things that we've been ignoring, and then eventually it disappears. I don't know about that. I'm not sure, Lydia. What do you think? I mean, especially given the demand you're getting for these thematic indices, is it going to just be absorbed into normal risk understanding at the end or not? And is it going to take 3 years or 4 to 5 years for that to happen too?
I mean, maybe we'll get to a position where there, and I've heard this kind of anecdotally, right, at different panels about this, that we will one day not have labeled bonds. We'll just have bonds where we consider what the use of proceeds is used for and what the ESG credentials of the issuer are. I think we're a really long way away from that. Obviously, because we still don't feel comfortable with various labels. We can't decide on which labels we need and the interaction between them. So I think we're a really long way away from that, or at least I feel that way from where I'm sitting. But I do think that increasingly what we'll see is demand for a blend. Like I said before, not just looking at use of proceeds anymore, but looking at that with the issuer level considerations on top. I think that that's, going to be the most common way of having labeled bonds in your portfolio. I can see even competitor indices that used to have just use of proceeds approaches on their labeled bond indices. They had governance consultations, and off the back of that, they're now adding that issuer level ESG consideration as well. So I think that will definitely just become par for the course. You won't just have like a labeled bond index, you'll have that, and then also the issuer level ESG as well. So I think it will be important for issuers to think about both, to be honest.
Okay.
If I can rebound on this, because it's also important when you come to the U.S. to measure the difference with this question of approaching sustainability through the risk lens versus through the impact lens. Okay, and it's very clear that here everybody is broadly comfortable with the risk approach, but when we move away from that, then there's significant discomfort. Let's put it this way. But it's very important, I think, to have the two in mind, because part of the tension between what we're trying to do in sustainable finance and, again, wider stakeholders is this confusion around, well, if I'm buying a sustainable product or an ESG product, I want to do something good with it, right? And if you then turn and say, well, actually, it's not doing anything good. It's just, if something bad happens, if something bad happens in the environment, we're taking that into account. I don't think that's good enough, and I think that fuels the tension around what we do. So we really need to integrate both. It is difficult, and maybe we need different measures. I mean, maybe we need to say, okay, look, well, ESG rating is about risk. That's it. And then we have another rating, and I think that's what was being said before. And so we'll have these two measures, and then we'll cut through it. There may be another way of doing it. Maybe we can integrate it. But it's always important to have this, these two aspects of sustainable finance in mind.
Okay, so that means we're going to keep doing this, which I think is sensible, because what it really is about elevating consciousness of the different things we need to do to ensure sustainability, isn't it?
Yep.
So it's a change of framework and change of thinking. That's a good note for us to finish up on. But I want to give you a last word, Nicholas, taking us forward. Remember, the theme is how do we massively grow capital flows to climate solutions? What's your parting reflection for the audience? And then I'll go ask you, Lydia, the same thing. The parting reflection for the audience on how we do this and what's going to happen.
On how we do this and how it's going to happen.
And if you want to share gossip, that's good too. Everyone wants gossip.
Now, is this how we're going to get the 5 trillion, or is how we're going to succeed? Let's do how we're going to succeed.
Difference.
No, but I think it's important to how we going to succeed. The work that we do in the sustainable bond market and what you're in sustainable finance is important not only because of the flows, the capital. It's about the way we inform the wider debate. It's when we talk to regulators, when we talk to policymakers, it's remarkable the extent to which their reflection is based on what's happening in our microcosm. So I think that we should continue to try to be, this thought leadership, which can lead to policy leadership. The other thing is, I think what's happening in the U.S. on the one hand is depressing with the ESG litigation thing, but on a very positive note, the IRA is potentially transformational. And one of the great strengths of this market is innovation and the ability to finance innovation. This is not something we have in Europe. We saw this in the COVID crisis. We saw, where did the solution come from? It was not only here, but there was a very significant part of it here. Why? Because we had the brain power, we had the financing, we had the ability to take risks, and we had the government. And I kind of see all that lining up now in climate. And the message I bring back to the Europeans is, this sort of degrowth, this, we're going to somehow transform our economies in a manner that we're not going to have a CO2 emission problem. I don't think that's going to work. I think it's part of the solution, but we really need to also have the second leg, and that's innovation. And so it's a positive note. I think the U.S., despite what this would have, is going to be a big part of the solution, and the IRA should really be saluted. And let's keep our fingers crossed.
Nice point. Lydia.
So, I think I'm just going to focus on one particular asset class with something I hope is kind of constructive. So, sovereign labeled bond issuance. It's one of the fastest growing areas, but there's as I found out through our investor survey, nowhere near enough issuance. 70% of the investors that we surveyed think that KPI-linked bonds have massive potential to grow in EM, and they really want to buy them. There's just literally no issuance. So, one of the things that we see is that there's very little engagement between institutional investors and DMOs. So we did host a roundtable last year with the Hungary DMO and a consortium of JP Morgan clients. And it was actually amazing to see the flow of information going two ways. And the investors were saying, okay, you have green bonds, but why haven't you done social and sustainability or SLBs? And they're saying, well, have you tried to talk to 15 different government departments before? So what came out of that for me is that there's this flow of information that needs to be occurring that isn't happening. And if we start that flow of information happening between investors and DMOs, we might stimulate this issuance, which we so desperately need, and get us to a position where those flows start coming, because the demand is there. I think the issue is just around the coordination and the structuring and the difficulties around that. And I think investors can actually concretely play a role in that through engagement. I think collaborative engagement as well, because it's kind of going to be more effective. So that's probably my closing thought.
I had a meeting with the head of the debt manager office of a southern European country recently who's considering green bond issuance. Nicholas, probably guess who it is. And he turned around to me at one point and said, you know what I like most about this green bond thing? I'm going to be able to get all those departments to do more on climate change. And I thought, this is a debt management office here? Sounded like a Greenpeace activist. What's going on here? And that is, in fact, what's been happening with sovereign and some subnational issuance around. We've seen the Irish government and MTMA, the debt management office, convene a monthly meeting of all the ministries to talk about what they're doing that's green that would qualify for the green bond.
Yeah.
Whoa! And so I think this is a really important point you make, really important in terms of our opportunities for scale, but our opportunities for change in our societies. Look, you all know what the challenge is. It's a very big challenge. I'll express the challenge, not in its negative side, but in terms of its positive side, which is how to scale up solutions, how to scale up capital. Think of that 9.2 to 50 trillion that's got to be invested, for example. We know governments are engaging, like the Japanese government, and those governments issue green bonds tend to get more engaged. If we do this, this is Keynesian stimulus. This is Keynesian stimulus on steroids. This is an extraordinary period in history of capital investment in stuff that is more infrastructure and less empty homes in Las Vegas, which is what got us into trouble in 2008. This is the stuff that drives wealth. Now, of course, as it's driving wealth, we've got to ensure that we don't bake in inequality and we address equality, because inequality is a predictor of fragility of societies. In other words, if we bake in inequality, we'll still collapse every time there's a climate shock. So there's stuff we've got to do on the resilience side, but the opportunity is incredible. And I think the thematic markets you've seen grow already, thanks to the work of the Green Bond Principles, thanks to the work of folks like JP Morgan Indices, thanks to the people you've heard on the panel today, and some of you, is amazing. It's just got to be way, way bigger. But it is an extraordinary opportunity, and I think that's what we have to focus on. And of course, that's how we get everyone excited. We're not going to get them excited by saying, oh, we're going to be ruined. We have to focus on the transition. We do know if we don't make it, it's bleak. It's very bleak. And that's worth keeping in mind to maintain our focus, our energy. Whether that's James getting up in the morning and feeling negative and up and day positive, that's up to you. What I will say, from my perspective, I think we all have an incredible opportunity. That is, we have the opportunity to make a difference in our area of work. Capital needs to flow. It's people in this room, on this stage, that are essential to making capital flow in the right direction, turn the sluice gates towards green. That's our job. So that's our privilege. Most of the world doesn't have that privilege. We are lucky. I know it sounds weird, but we are extraordinarily lucky. We are, of course, have a duty as a result as well. When we meet again next year, because we'll be holding this conference on an annual basis in New York from now on, I hope you will come back, you will join us and share your stories, I should say, your stories of the incredible work that's happened in the next 12 months, which is so pivotal to our future. Good luck. We need it. You need to succeed. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lydia on the